Like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt who built their empire with the help of a grand vizier, Queen Elizabeth II also has a grand vizier who serves as her most trusted advisor. His name is Lord Evelyn Rothschild, and he is the second wealthiest and most powerful person on earth. He is also Lord of the world's financial capital, the city-state of London. Lord Rothschild and his ring of power hide their identities behind 13 city council members who stand in as their representatives. On November 30th, 2000, Lord Rothschild, now in his 70s, got married in London to a wealthy Zionist businesswoman named Lynn Forrester. The couple then jetted to Washington and spent their wedding night in the White House. Just months before 9/11, they moved to New York and settled into their 18th floor luxury palace at River House, where 2 private terraces offered them front row seats for the scheduled 911 show. Just how rich and powerful is Lord Evelyn Rothschild? Historically, the Rothschild family wealth was hidden in underground vaults. The Rothschilds' secret financial records were never audited and never accounted for. Their family commissioned biographies give the illusion that their family fortune has dwindled, but researchers estimate their wealth at close to $500 trillion, more than half the wealth of the entire world. Besides their many castles, palace mansions, wineries, racehorses, and exotic resorts, the Rothschilds bought Reuters in the 1800s. Reuters then bought the Associated Press, which selects and delivers the same news stories to the entire world, day after day. They have controlling interest in 3 major television networks and easily avoid media attention since they own it. Until recently, they owned and operated England's Royal Mint and continue to be the gold agent for the Bank of England, which they also direct. They control the LBMA, London Bullion Market Association, where 30 to 42 million ounces of gold worth over $11 billion are traded daily. The Rothschilds earn millions weekly just on transaction fees alone. They also fix the world price of gold on a daily basis and profit from its ups and downs. Over the centuries, the Rothschilds have amassed trillions of dollars worth of gold bullion in their subterranean vaults and have cornered the world's gold supply. They own controlling interest in the world's largest oil company, Royal Dutch Shell. They operate phony charities and offshore banking services where the wealth of the black nobility and the Vatican is hidden in secret accounts at Rothschild Swiss banks, trusts, and holding companies. Although Evelyn Rothschild looks like a harmless gray-haired old man, make no mistake about it, Rothschild and his ancestors have handpicked presidents, crashed stock markets, bankrupted nations, orchestrated wars, and sponsored the mass murder and impoverishment of millions. The wealth hoarded by this one family alone could feed, clothe, and shelter every human being on earth. How did Evelyn Rothschild become the filthy rich Grand Vizier to Queen Elizabeth II and godfather of the black nobility? By birth, Evelyn Rothschild is the great-great-great-grandson of Mayer Rothschild and is passing the godfathership down to David de Rothschild. Their story begins in 18th century Frankfurt, Germany, on a cobblestone street called Frankfurt on the Main. Mayer Amschel Bauer was a goldsmith and a loan shark. He hung a red hexagram shield over his doorway and changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild, which means red shield in German. The red hexagram shield was the symbol for the world revolutionary movement. Family biographers describe Mayer Rothschild as a poor man who lived with his family above his goldsmith shop and sold rare coins to royal customers. Contrary to appearances, Mayer stashed a big supply of gold, precious coins, and jewels in special hiding places inside his house. One special hiding place was beneath the back courtyard, where he accessed his strongbox through an underground passageway. Mayer taught his 5 sons the tricks of the trade. To them, he wasn't just their father, he was their lord and master. To them, he was Lord Mayer. In 1773, Mayer Rothschild invited 12 wealthy, revolutionary-minded men to his goldsmith shop. Together, they formulated a plan to seize control of the world's wealth. They made a pact to secretly pool their money and influence to bankrupt the nations of the world and create a new world order. Using his connections, Mayer teamed up with Prince William, who was the ruler of Germany's Hesse-Kassel district. William had a reputation as a cold-blooded loan shark who trained and rented out his Hessian soldiers as mercenary troops. It was a profitable blood-for-money business that made Prince William one of Europe's richest men. Working as Prince William's agent, Mayer Rothschild collected fees for each dead Hessian soldier killed on the battlefield. He hired his sons to help him collect the blood money from renter nations. Since wars were good for the rent-a-troop business, Prince William used his royal connections in Denmark and England to provoke these wars. King George III of England rented Hessian soldiers from Mayer Rothschild and Prince William to fight the American colonists. American colonists had already shot down millions of North American Indians whose spears and arrows were helpless against the deadly gunfire. The worst Holocaust in human history occurred not in Nazi Germany, but on American soil. By 1776, British and Hessian troops arrived on American shores, ready to fight the American colonists.
They're preparing for an attack.
And we won't have long to wait either. See there? Hessian troops to the north.
Hessian mercenaries! I can't believe the king is paying Germans to come here and kill British colonists.
The colonists won their independence, and Mayer Rothschild won his blood money for the heads of each and every Hessian soldier killed on the battlefield. Back in Europe, Napoleon, with his mighty French army, became master of Europe. When Napoleon and his troops stormed into Frankfurt, Germany, William feared for his life and his vast fortune. He left $3 million in the hands of Mayer Rothschild to pay the Hessian soldiers. Then he escaped to Denmark to stay with his royal relatives, all of whom were descendants of the tribe of Dan. Mayer Rothschild received a stock market tip from his World Revolutionary Network. Instead of paying the Hessian soldiers with the $3 million that was left to him by William, he bet the money on his insider stock market tip. With his new fortune, Mayer Rothschild set up 5 family banks to be run by each of his 5 sons in London, Paris, Naples, Frankfurt, and Vienna. On September 19, 1812, Mayer Rothschild died at the age of 68. He left instructions that the amount of the inheritance must never be made public, that secrecy and ruthlessness must be used in all business practices, and that family members must intermarry with their own blood relatives to keep the family fortune all in the family. All 5 brothers dedicated themselves to their ancestors' world revolutionary dream. That dream was to control the entire world under one world ruler by disarming the nations of the world.
A king, the son of David, will purify Jerusalem from the nations that trample her down, destroy the lawless nations and gather a holy people whom he will lead in righteousness.
Mayer Rothschild's most successful sons were Nathan, who ran the London Bank, and James, who ran the Paris Bank. Together, they changed the face of history and became known throughout Europe as the Demon Brothers. Their father had given them a detailed New World Order plan for world control. Adam Weishaupt wrote and completed the plan on May 1st, 1776 with Rothschild financing. It was a futuristic plan that would put New World Order members over the next centuries into political power positions.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly.
It was a plan to divide and conquer the nations of the world by provoking wars, then profiting from war loans and from the sale of weapons to both sides. Exhausted by war, terror, and chaos, humanity would eventually bow down to one world ruler and one world army as a solution. It was a plan to control public opinion by purchasing the controlling shares in TV networks, newspapers, publishing houses, and film studios.
Briefings and updates from Washington and around the world every 15 minutes throughout the business day. As influential leaders, global markets, and your money take center stage on CNBC.
Completely on the stage, but he was on the scaffold.
Sports, games, and alcohol would be used to distract the masses. Laws would be changed, banks would be monopolized, and people and nations would be made into obedient debt slaves. With Rothschild financing, Adam Weishaupt formed a secret world revolutionary group called the Illuminati. He recruited thousands of influential members by convincing them that only men of superior ability had the right to rule over the ignorant masses. French police exposed the plan when they found documents on an Illuminati courier who was struck by lightning while traveling from Germany to France. The Illuminati was forced underground. They took refuge in the lodges of a secret brotherhood called the Freemasons, who practiced death and rebirth rituals and whose history dates back to the construction of Solomon's Temple. Nathan and James Rothschild came up with a scheme that would put the Illuminati plan for world control into action. It would also make them filthy rich. The brothers helped finance both sides of Napoleon's famous Battle of Waterloo between the French and the English. With advanced knowledge of the British victory, Nathan Rothschild spread lies that the British had been defeated, which caused a stock market crash. While panicked English investors sold their life savings, Nathan bought up their market shares for pennies on the dollar. When official news of the British victory over Napoleon was announced, the English stock market skyrocketed, and so did Nathan's wealth. In one foul swoop, the Demon Brothers had double-crossed the English masses and taken control of the Bank of England. Flaunting their stupendous wealth, the brothers went on a lavish spending spree. They bought mansions, fashionable clothes, and hosted extravagant parties. By 1818, they had picked the pockets of French investors by crashing the French government bond market. According to plan, the brothers formed the world's first international bank and named it N.M. Rothschild and Sons. The Pope became their most famous customer. The Catholic Church, which had financed the wholesale slaughter, torture, and looting of hundreds of thousands of Muslims during the Christian Crusades, were now doing business with the Demon Brothers. By 1823, the Rothschilds were guardians of the entire papal treasure and took over the financial operations of the Catholic Church. Enraged citizens accused the Rothschilds of conspiring to control the world's money markets. Fearing for their lives, the Rothschilds retreated into the shadows and cast their eyes on the youthful United States of America. To avoid publicity, the Rothschilds made themselves invisible by creating and hiding behind two front companies, J.P. Morgan and Kuhn and Loeb.
More and more power was becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. By 1906, J.P. Morgan's bank controlled 1/3 of America's railways and almost 70% of the steel industry. He eventually had a stake in the major companies of the 20th century, among them AT&T, ITT, General Electric, General Motors, and DuPont.
At one point, Morgan made the offhanded comment, "America is good enough for me." And the newspaper of William Jennings Bryan retorted, "Whenever you're tired of it, you can give it back." I mean, that was the image of J.P. Morgan, the owner of the United States.
The success of Morgan's industrials was quickly reflected in the Dow Jones Industrial Average.
The Rothschilds bought controlling interest in England's British East India Shipping Company and the illegal opium trade with China. They offered junior partnerships to New England's leading American families. The Russell, Coolidge, Delano, Forbes, and Perkins families became fabulously rich, smuggling opium aboard their speedy clipper ships into China. In 1820, Samuel Russell bought out the Perkins Syndicate and ran the opium smuggling operation with his partner, Warren Delano Jr., who was the grandfather of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The United States flag was designed after the British East India Company flag with 13 red and white stripes. Both flags copy the red and white striped sails of the Viking ships, which were the color standard for the tribe of Dan.
Finally, Britain found a commodity that China would take: opium. Imported from India. Just a few chests at first, and then thousands. When the Chinese authorities tried to stop the opium trade, the British sent in their gunboats. After nearly 20 years of turmoil, the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 not only allowed opium to be imported, but handed over China's ports and all her international trade to Western control. After the war, opium poured into China on an even greater scale, and her emperors were powerless to stop it.
In 1842, the British stole Hong Kong from China in an opium drug deal called the Treaty of Nanking. The Russell family, who controlled the U.S. arm of the Rothschild drug smuggling operations, set up the Skull and Bones fraternity at Yale University. America's big money families formed the fraternity's inner power circle. Taft, Russell, Schiff, Harriman, Bush, Warburg, Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Stimson, Weyerhaeuser, Vanderbilt, Goodyear, and Pillsbury were all members. These families intermarried over the generations to form America's big money aristocracy. Skull and Bones member Alphonso Taft catapulted his son, William Taft, right into the top job at the White House. President Taft's 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution guaranteed the right of big money insiders to hand-pick senators and buy control of the United States Senate. Today, the most influential members of the CIA, the U.S. government, and big finance are Skull and Bonesmen. The Skull and Bones Brotherhood is rooted in Jewish Kabbalism and in European Freemasonry, which practices similar death and rebirth rituals. Freemasons are blindfolded, symbolically slain with a noose around their neck, and lowered into an open grave. Once raised from the grave, they must look towards a light called the morning star. The Latin translation for morning star is Lucifer. The phoenix bird and double-headed eagle are important symbols in Freemasonry. In Egyptian mythology, the phoenix bird is a god who rose to heaven in the form of a star like Lucifer after his fire immolation of death and rebirth. Death and rebirth themes in satanic witchcraft are marketed to youth in movies like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. The Hollywood movie lots are owned by the Illuminati Lehman Brothers, Rothschild agent Kuhn and Loeb, and Goldman Sachs. Freemasonry has a pyramid structure. The highest level is a 33rd degree Mason. Solomon's Temple in Israel was located at the 33rd parallel. Most Masons remain at the 3rd degree and provide a cover through their community charitable activities. The Illuminati at the top of the pyramid is the all-seeing eye. At the bottom are the unthinking, hardworking, law-abiding, tax-paying, God-fearing debt slaves called the Goyim, or sheep. Giuseppe Mazzini of Italy was a 33rd degree Mason who replaced Adam Weishaupt as head of the Illuminati in 1834. Mazzini was a member of the Italian Carbonari and created the Mafia's blood rituals and secret oath. He gave the dreaded Cosa Nostra the name Mafia. Mafia is an acronym spelling the names of the original mafiosa godfathers: M for Mazzini, A for Otto Riza, F for Ferti, I for Incendi, and A for Avaligmenti. The Mafia arrived on American shores in the 1890s with Illuminati financing to establish underground networks and the black market system. Mazzini appointed America's Albert Pike as sovereign pontiff of Universal Freemasonry and the coordinator of the Illuminati U.S. activities. Pike was a Tennessee Ku Klux Klan judicial officer. A known Satanist, Pike indulged in phallic worship and the occult. He wore a satanic Baphomet symbol around his neck and used his bracelet to summon Lucifer. Pike used the KKK to keep blacks out of the Masonic lodges.
In August 1924, Imperial Wizard Hiram Wesley Evans organized a parade of 40,000 Klan members down Washington's Pennsylvania Avenue to the Washington Monument. This event proved the Klan had achieved power, not just in the South and Midwest, but on a national level.
In a letter to Mazzini dated August 15, 1871, Pike graphically outlined a blueprint for 3 planned world wars. World War I would weaken, topple, and destroy the powerful Tsarist government in Russia. World War II would pit Great Britain against Germany, destroy Nazism, and create the Zionist State of Israel. World War III would be ignited by fueling aggression between the Zionists of Israel and the Arab world, who would eventually destroy one another. Social, political, and economic chaos would then force the masses to accept one world army and one world government ruled by the Illuminati. In Pike's famous Masonic guidebook called Morals and Dogma, he writes, "Lucifer, light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light? Doubt it not." Albert Pike was a Confederate general in the American Civil War. The Rothschilds sent British agents to conspire with Pike and with U.S. politicians and provoke the rebellion that started the American Civil War. The Rothschilds, whose massive fortune had been built on provoked wars and war loans, offered loans to both sides of the Civil War at 24 to 36% interest. When President Abraham Lincoln tried to stop the loan sharks by issuing greenback dollars interest-free, a gunman with European connections named John Wilkes Booth shot him down in cold blood. Following the Civil War, Albert Pike was convicted of treason and sent to prison, but President Andrew Johnson, a 33rd-degree Mason, pardoned him. One of Johnson's first acts as president was to veto the Civil Rights Act for blacks, who had been shipped in chains to their wealthy American slave owners. Stealing slaves was a crime, but torturing and beating them was not. A statue of Albert Pike, a convicted traitor, Satanist, 33rd-degree Mason, and Ku Klux Klan racist, stands today in the heart of Washington, D.C. On the opposite side of America stands an honorary statue of Giuseppe Mazzini, the Illuminati mafia boss who put the letter M for Mazzini into the name Mafia. Close by is another statue donated by the French Grand Orient Temple Masons to the Masons of America, celebrating the first Masonic republic called the United States of America. 14 U.S. presidents, including George Washington, are known to be 33rd-degree Masons. Leopold and Nathaniel Rothschild became the next generation of godfathers to take charge of the family fortune. They were like the Parker brothers of Monopoly, and they played the game like they invented it. The brothers were the world champions, and that's because they knew the secret to winning. The secret to winning was to cheat, and the best way to cheat was to become the banker and rewrite the rules, so that's exactly what they did. Since the U.S. Congress was already in charge of the rules in the Federal Reserve Bank, winning the U.S. version of Monopoly meant they would have to outsmart Congress. So they sent Jacob Schiff, their trusted lifelong friend and neighbor from Frankfurt, Germany, to New York City, and they put him in charge of their friend company called Kuhn and Loeb. Then they ganged up with other big players by investing in Rockefeller Oil, Harriman Railroads, Carnegie Steel, and Brown Brothers Investment Banking. By 1901, the Rothschilds had amassed $22.2 billion in U.S. assets. The mayor of New York, John Hylan, called them the invisible government, while Congressman Louis McFadden called them a dark crew of financial pirates who would slit a man's throat to get a dollar. When Woodrow Wilson became President of the United States in 1912, he sold out America. Wilson was backed by Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg, who worked in the United States as German immigrant agents for the Rothschilds. In 1913, Paul Warburg rewrote the U.S. monopoly rules with the help of Senator Nelson Aldrich. They called the new rules the Federal Reserve Act. With President Woodrow Wilson's blessing, the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank became a privately owned central bank, free of government control. The pirates divvied up the private stock in America's money supply and made Rothschild agent Paul Warburg head of the U.S. Federal Reserve. To collect their bounty, they also created the Income Tax Act and the hated IRS. With the stroke of President Wilson's treasonous pen, the banker gangsters became the Fed in 1913 and have owned a virtual monopoly over the U.S. economy and the taxpayers' money ever since. They can print money out of thin air, control treasury loans, and profit from interest rates. Since their biggest windfalls come from loan profits and weapons sales, wars and death are not only profitable, they're desirable and necessary. Today, American citizens owe these merchants of death approximately $70,000 per citizen. Adolf Hitler wasn't the only madman to rule over Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II led Germany to its destruction in World War I. Crippled since birth with a useless arm, Kaiser Wilhelm was the grandson of Queen Victoria and the great-uncle of today's Queen Elizabeth II. It was no accident that Kaiser Wilhelm chose Max Warburg as head of Germany's Secret Service. The Warburgs and the Rothschilds controlled Germany's central bank called the Reichsbank, which was founded by Mayer Rothschild. While Max and Felix Warburg helped finance Germany in World War I, their brother Paul Warburg of Kuhn and Loeb helped finance the American side by selling war bonds through the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. The Rothschild and Warburg printing presses worked tirelessly on both sides of the Atlantic, rolling out debt money. Germany won the First World War by 1916 without a single shot being fired on German soil. British convoys were blown out of the Atlantic by German subs, the French army mutinied, and the Russian army was defecting. With British Prime Minister Lloyd George up against a wall, Lionel Rothschild and the Jewish Zionists offered the British a deal they couldn't refuse. "We'll bring the United States into the war as your ally and win the war for you," they said, "if you'll promise us Palestine." In April of 1917, President Wilson got the green light and declared war on Germany. Because of overwhelming opposition to the war, Wilson invoked the draft and passed the Espionage Act, forcing Americans to fight or be thrown in jail. Billions of U.S. taxpayers' money was delivered to the British war machine, money that was never repaid. In return, the British government wrote the famous Balfour Declaration and addressed it to none other than Lord Lionel Rothschild. The declaration promised Palestine and Israel to the Rothschild Zionists. The Zionists believe that they are entitled to the land of Israel because, according to the Bible, Israel was promised to the Jews by God, and according to the Bible, the Jews are God's chosen race of people, a race favored by God above all others.
1817, Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land, and the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by the Earl of Balfour, a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and by the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate.
The Versailles Treaty negotiations after World War I were held behind closed doors at the luxurious private mansion of yet another Rothschild family member named Edmund Rothschild. Treaty negotiators included Rothschild agent Paul Warburg as a United States delegate and Paul's brother Max Warburg as a German delegate.
Clemenceau, Lord George, and President Wilson have pulled up armchairs and crouched low over the map. It is appalling that these ignorant and irresponsible men should be cutting Asia Minor to bits as if they were dividing a cake. During the afternoon, there is the final revision of the frontiers of Austria. Hungary is partitioned, indolently, irresponsibly partitioned. Then the Yugoslav frontier. Then tea and macaroons.
The Versailles Peace Treaty forced Germany to accept guilt for the war. As punishment, Germany lost its army, navy, and colonies and had to pay the cost of the war through a debt to the gangster banksters that could never be repaid. World War I killed 9 million soldiers, injured, crippled, and impoverished millions, and collapsed 4 empires with large parts of France, Belgium, and Russia left devastated. Wars throughout history have always been waged by the ruling master class for conquest, power, and profit, and the subject class have always fought their battles. It wasn't until the close of World War I that soldiers began to ask why they were killing and being killed. The League of Nations was the money cartel's first attempt at world control, but Tsar Nicholas II of Russia caught on to their plot and sabotaged it. That proved to be a deadly mistake. Schiff, Warburg, Rockefeller, Harriman, and Morgan backed the uprisings that led to the 1917 Russian Revolution. Their strategy was to finance both sides of wars and revolutions which gave them control over the winners, the losers, and the outcome.
The execution and removal of the bodies took 20 minutes. 3 centuries of Tsarist Russia were gone.
Between 1918 and 1921, 14 million Russians died from war and starvation under Lenin's Bolsheviks. By 1919, Lenin ran up a national debt to the Rothschild banksters of $60 billion, which put Russia firmly under their control. As Mayor Rothschild once said, "Give me control of a nation's money and I care not who makes her laws." To this day, the Rothschilds have stopped the heirs to the Tsar's fortunes from claiming their deposits held in Rothschild banks. Those fortunes are now worth an estimated $50 billion. Joseph Stalin, who was financed by the same money cartel, replaced Lenin as Russia's brutal new dictator. Using terror and death threats, Stalin's job was to industrialize Russia and turn communism into a powerful counterforce to democracy. Manufactured conflicts between these two powerful political forces would be the ideal excuse for all future wars and for dividing, conquering, and ruling the world. The Roaring Twenties was a decade of peace and prosperity in the United States.
Installment plans were created to make buying high-priced items more affordable. Instead of shelling out $100 for a new washing machine, consumers would put $5 down and pay $8 a month. The dangers of debt and high interest rates didn't enter the minds of most Americans, and shopping raged throughout the decade. Advertising became part of the fabric of American culture as ads dominated newspapers and magazines. Sex appeal, social snobbery, outrageous claims, and fabricated scientific studies convinced consumers to buy more.
With massive corporate growth, high employment, and a post-war bull market on Wall Street, first-time American investors went on a stock market buying spree.
One wanted a piece of this prosperity. People bought stock on margin or credit for as little as 10% down. They then used the stock as collateral to borrow more money to buy more stock. Then they did it again. The market was a free-for-all with no regulations of any kind.
The party ended on October 29, 1929, when the stock market crashed and caught everyone off guard, everyone except the banksters. J.P. Morgan and Kuhn and Loeb sent advance warnings to their group of insiders. These Federal Reserve pirates caused the crash by printing a whopping 62% inflation rate, then raising interest rates to an alarming 6%. While the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and other Federal Reserve pirates escaped the fallout, outsiders lost everything, some of them leaping to their death from office towers. 30 of the 80 billion that industrial stocks have been worth vanished into thin air, but thin air was just another name for the international banksters. Following the crash, the Great Depression put 1/3 of the U.S. workforce out of work. The bankster-owned banks foreclosed on property and took possession of people's homes and farms. When panicked citizens lined up at banks to withdraw their hard-earned savings, the banksters gave them only 10 cents on the dollar. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow decided to do something about it. Homeless and desperate, many Americans set up tent cities and rode the rails looking for work.
I went walking that riven-up highway. I saw above me an inland skyway. Saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. A paradise to live in or see. But believe it or not, you won't find it so hot if you ain't got the do-re-mi.
we don't want to overlook the fact that this country was on the brink of hell. We were looking and searching for anything to get us out of this mess. Communism looked very, very attractive to people. We're going to share everything. You're not going to have to worry about being out of a job. We're going to be one great big happy family.
There was a lot of baloney. You weren't, but that we believed it.
Either on the trains or in jungles, you do get to talking about what this means in a broader sense, the social struggle. Why does it have to be this way when the goddamn guys on Wall Street all got millions of dollars? And I can remember being aware of the difference between the working class and the ruling class in this society, to put it in the terms that I use today.
The voice coming chanting and the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me.
Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee, claimed the crash was planned by the international bankers who sought to become rulers of us all. In his famous 1932 congressional address, he said, "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board has cheated the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt 3 times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States through the defects of the law which it operates and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves." Following a series of death threats, McFadden died from food poisoning followed by a heart attack under suspicious circumstances. In his book, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Professor Anthony B. Sutton shows documented evidence that U.S. corporations supplied money, gas, vehicles, and weaponry that helped Hitler launch World War II. Prescott Bush, father of George Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush, supplied raw materials and funneled vast sums of money and credit to Hitler's Third Reich. Under Trading with the Enemies Act, the U.S. government seized businesses operated by Prescott Bush and Skull and Bonesman Averell Harriman, including New York's Union Banking Corporation. These seizures were based on evidence that Bush and Harriman had been operating front organizations for Hitler's Third Reich. Their German partner was the notorious Nazi industrialist named Fritz Thyssen, who wrote a book of confessions called I Paid Hitler. Professor Sutton lists Rockefeller Standard Oil, Henry Ford's Ford Motor Company, J.P. Morgan's General Electric, ITT, and the DuPonts as suppliers for Germany's rearmament program. But why on earth would Jewish bankers and corporations finance a monster like Adolf Hitler? It is a well-known fact that Adolf Hitler went to great lengths to cover up his family history, even arranging for the assassination of Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss, who investigated Hitler's family. The Dollfuss file, now in the hands of the British Secret Service, revealed that Adolf Hitler's grandmother, named Maria Anna Schicklgruber, worked in Vienna as a live-in housemaid at Solomon Rothschild's manor next to his hotel. The information was traced through her compulsory registration card. Solomon Rothschild was one of Mayor Rothschild's 5 banker sons. Separated from his wife, Solomon had a reputation with police as a lecherous womanizer. When Maria Anna Schicklgruber's pregnancy was discovered, she was dismissed. Adolf Hitler, the grandson of Solomon Rothschild, earned a reputation as the most evil man the world has ever known. But more evil than Adolf Hitler were the men who created and financed him. Hitler's revolutionary activities in Germany landed him in prison for 5 years. This so-called prison was Landsberg Castle, a comfortable, privileged pastoral setting where Hitler was groomed for the job of Führer. His coaches, Rudolf Hess and Hermann Göring, helped him write the infamous book Mein Kampf. Upon his release, the book was widely circulated, and Hitler traveled throughout Germany, delivering prepared speeches with Rothschild Warburg financing via the secret Thule and Veril societies. The Jews were to blame, shouted Hitler, for the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty and for Germany's financial ruin. What possible explanation could there be for Jewish businessmen supporting an anti-Semitic madman like Adolf Hitler and the extermination of millions of innocent Jews? One of the world's dirtiest secrets is that the exterminated Jews in Nazi Germany were not considered real Jews. They were considered Khazar Russians and Eastern Europeans whose ancestors converted to Judaism in 740 AD under their king, King Bulan. Their bloodline dates back to the Turkish tribes and to the powerful empire of Khazaria that once controlled all of Russia. Arthur Koestler, who wrote The 13th Tribe, claims that over 90% of today's Jews are racially non-Jewish and have no genetic relationship to the 12 tribes of Israel. Today's Jews, says Koestler, are more related to Attila the Hun than King Solomon of Israel. 2,000 years ago, when the Roman conquerors evicted the 12 tribes from Israel, the largest tribes, called Dan and Naphtali, settled in Denmark and Norway. Their Viking king, called King Canute, was crowned king of England, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Koestler calls the majority of today's Jews the 13th tribe because they are racially not Jewish. The Rothschilds' incestuous bloodline can be traced through their ancestor, Naphtali Hertz, who is named after their tribe of Naphtali. Over the centuries, the Rothschilds have intermarried with authentic Jewish royalty, ensuring their bloodline back to King Solomon of Israel. Denmark, which literally means the mark of Dan, maintained a truce with Germany's Nazi occupying forces for nearly 3 years. When Hitler's SS moved to arrest the Jews of Denmark, the Danish government helped ferry them to safety in Sweden and Britain. But why were the Jews of Denmark?
Death camps were not an accident. The seeds of hatred were planted long before the war began, and the extermination was carried out with some German industry in compliance, while the world looked on.
While the German subsidiaries of U.S. corporations made fortunes from the war industry and from the free slave labor of non-ethnic Jews, America also looked on. Masonic U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the grandson of opium smuggler Warren Delano Jr., was too busy bombing the Japanese and developing weapons of mass destruction. Roosevelt chose Skull and Bonesman Henry Stimson as his Secretary of War. Roosevelt and Stimson ordered massive firebombing raids on Japan's 6 largest cities, killing and burning alive 250,000 Japanese men, women, and children. In the United States, innocent Japanese-American families were thrown into internment prison camps. Japanese assets were frozen, Japan's oil lifeline was cut off, and crippling trade sanctions were imposed. This godless campaign of terror and merciless overkill demanded nothing less than total surrender and the removal of Japan's emperor. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, it was the suicidal act of a desperate and devastated nation. Like the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, U.S. intelligence had well-documented advance warnings of the planned attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet, like Bush and Rumsfeld, Roosevelt and Stimson did nothing to stop it. The big question is, why? Historians like Robert Stinnett and John Toland believe that because U.S. citizens wouldn't participate in another world war, a direct attack on U.S. soil would change their minds. The attack could also be used to justify the testing of Roosevelt's new atomic weapons of mass destruction on a human population. Einstein introduced Roosevelt to the atomic bomb in 1939. Harry Truman, a relatively unknown, uneducated business school dropout and the son of a mule trader, replaced Roosevelt as U.S. president in 1945. Truman owed his political career to Tom Pendergast, a gun-running, bootlegging, prostitution, and narcotics ring crook who sponsored Harry Truman's election into the U.S. Senate. On the advice of James Burns and Henry Stimson, Dirty Harry dropped the first radioactive atomic bomb on the human population of Hiroshima at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, without even a warning.
2,000 feet over the city of Hiroshima. Heat from the center of the explosion reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, melting buildings and setting bridges on fire. Rivers and streams throughout the city began to boil. People evaporated where they stood, leaving shadows of their bodies scorched onto the streets. In a matter of seconds, 4 square miles of Hiroshima became an atomic wasteland. Several minutes passed. Then a black rain began to fall on the city. Sticky, pebble-sized drops of radioactive ash. 80,000 people died from the atomic explosion.
Tohoko was a student at Yamanaka Girls High School.
Heat rays set her hair on fire. Shockwaves would have reached her 3.5 seconds after the explosion, and her body would have been subject to pressure of up to 3.3 tons per square meter. This is roughly equivalent to the blast that would have hit her.
3 days later, while Japanese survivors were still reeling from the radioactive fallout, the United States dropped a second type of atomic bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, testing it on the human population of Nagasaki.
Was dropped on Nagasaki.
In retaliation for 2,400 American military deaths at Pearl Harbor that could have been prevented because of advance warnings, 2 U.S. atomic bombs evaporated 130,000 Japanese civilians and their families, and another 90,000 in the horrendous aftermath. To this day, Japanese survivors and their offspring suffer related genetic deformities, cancers, nightmares, and permanent environmental destruction.
My goodness alive. Young lady with the red hair right behind the school teacher there.
Mr. President, why did you drop the atom bomb?
Mr. President, the future wants to know, was it right to drop the atom bomb?
Years later, Harry Truman was asked if he did any soul-searching before giving his approval to use A-bombs against Japan. His reply was, "Hell no, I made it like that." And he snapped his fingers in the air.
In May 1952, Harry Truman was awarded an honorary plaque, and a village in Israel was named in his honor.
I'm very touched and grateful, and a little bit overwhelmed. They have a village named for me, but when they're talking about a statue, want me to join George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Cham Weissman, I have about to come to the conclusion that I'm not ready yet to go into a piece of marble.
World War II took the lives of 35 million trusting, patriotic, flag-waving people willing to die for their country or die for freedom or die a hero. But what they really died for was the lies and the propaganda. With the fall of Nazi Germany right on schedule, Stalin officially announced to the world that Hitler had escaped. U.S. and British spin doctors quickly changed the story, claiming that Hitler had committed suicide and that his body had been burned beyond recognition by his own officers. The key words are beyond recognition. While people were busy celebrating the end of World War II and believing what they wanted to believe, the international banksters who had sponsored the genocide, torture, and suffering of non-ethnic Jews stole their wealth from Swiss bank accounts just as they had stolen the wealth of the Russian czars after financing the Russian Revolution. The Vatican was also tied to plundering Nazi gold, which had been stolen from the Jews. It is a well-documented fact that Pope Pius XII lent his support to the anti-Semitic Hitler and his Nazi regime. With the fall of Nazi Germany, the Rothschilds wasted no time waving their Balfour Declaration at the British government and reminding them of their written promise to give them Palestine. But how could the British promise the Arab land of Palestine to the Jews? In 1917, the British parachuted free opium and hashish to the Turkish troops and stole Palestine from them.
One ingenious stratagem was to parachute hashish and opium to the Turkish troops to try to keep their mind off the fighting. Allenby's strategy worked brilliantly.
During World War II, the British needed Arab oil and signed an agreement with the Arabs which forbid Jewish immigration into Palestine. Then at the end of the war, the British broke their agreement with the Arabs and allowed the Rothschild Jewish Zionists to smuggle hundreds of thousands of Jews from around the world into Palestine. To win public support, the Rothschilds, who owned Reuters and the Associated Press, bombarded their media empire with images of homeless Jewish Holocaust refugees crowded together in ships off the coast of Palestine. On October 24, 1945, the bankster pirates gave birth to their most powerful weapon of global control, the United Nations. According to plan, the British pulled out of Palestine and gave the land to the Jewish Zionists. These Zionist extremists call themselves God's chosen race of people and believe they have a God-given right to the land of the Palestinians. It is important to know that the land now called Israel was originally called Canaan in ancient times. Canaan was populated by the Canaanite people, who were the ancestors of today's Palestinians imprisoned in refugee camps in Israel. About 3,500 years ago, the Semitic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for 100 years, but were expelled from Egypt into Canaan. The Egyptians called these Hyksos people the Habarus, which means Hebrews. These expelled Hebrews invaded and conquered the land of Canaan and changed the name of the land from Canaan to Israel. In 135 AD, the name was once again changed to Palestine after the Romans conquered the land. In 1948, the bankster-controlled United Nations officially turned Palestine into the Zionist State of Israel. To deal with the millions of Palestinian residents, the Israeli Jews massacred and drove them from their villages and homeland. The Jews herded the Palestinians into two separated regions called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Rothschilds soon began financing Jewish Holocaust refugees to build illegal Jewish settlements on Palestinian land. These illegal Jewish settlements set the stage for Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's reign of terror against Palestinians who dared to defend what was left of their stolen homeland. Like Saddam Hussein, Sharon violated dozens of UN resolutions by using hundreds of tanks and American-supplied gunships and planes in an unrelenting campaign of bombing, murdering, bulldozing, starving, and terrorizing the Palestinians off of what remained of their land. In violation of international law, Israel also secretly developed over 100 nuclear weapons of mass destruction capable of vaporizing the entire Middle East. Defenseless against Israel's U.S.-backed military and media campaign, the Palestinian Muslims fought back with sticks and stones and suicide as their only means of defense against the wholesale theft of their ancient homeland. The story of the Bible was written by Hebrew Jews, who tell us that the Hebrew Jews are God's chosen race of people. Bible prophecy predicts that they will one day rule the world from their temple throne in Jerusalem, and that the world's King of Kings will be a descendant of King David and King Solomon of Israel. That is what Bible believers all over the world believe will come to pass. To turn this Bible prophecy into a reality would demand the cooperation of world leaders. It would also mean building a third temple in Jerusalem over the ancient ruins of King Solomon's temple. But there is one giant-sized problem. A sacred Muslim shrine called Dome of the Rock was already built on top of the ruins of Solomon's temple in the 7th century. It still stands majestically today in the heart of Jerusalem, and it would have to be destroyed. Since Israel is surrounded by not-so-friendly Muslim nations, and with millions of Muslim Palestinians living in Israel's West Bank and Gaza Strip, this Bible prophecy is impossible to fulfill. Or is it? Like a screenplay for a movie, the Bible story was written by Hebrew Jews. But who is the director and the producer? Is it God, or is it a special interest group of the world's wealthiest men? The Rothschilds, whose front companies had helped finance Hitler and the Jewish slave labor camps, had turned Jewish Holocaust victims into victimizers. Imprisoned inside barbed wire refugee camps, the Palestinians began to resemble the victims of Nazi concentration camps. According to author Simon Schama, the Rothschilds own 80% of the land of Israel. Even the flag of Israel flies the hexagram symbol from the Rothschild family's red shield. The hexagram has 6 points, 6 triangles, and 6 sides on the central hexagram. The numbers 666 are associated with the biblical prophecies that predict an apocalyptic Third World War. In their national bestseller, Secret War Against the Jews, authors Loftus and Ahrens reveal indisputable evidence that Hitler's top Nazi general, General Reinhard Gehlen, transferred his entire network of Nazi spies and double agents to Fort Hunt, Virginia, to join America's newly formed CIA. This highly secretive operation was codenamed Operation Paperclip and included Holocaust mastermind Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's personal friend and favorite SS colonel. Since its illegitimate birth at the close of World War II, the CIA has always represented the interests of the banksters, not the American people. Nelson Rockefeller, who became U.S. Vice President, and Allen Dulles, who became CIA Director, erased the Nazi pasts of hundreds of Nazi spies and scientists who they smuggled into the United States. Others were smuggled into Canada and South America along Rockefeller's rat line, using Vatican passports and money. Rockefeller was also guilty of supplying South American oil to Nazi subs that sunk American ships and killed American servicemen. The Jewish Zionists spied on Rockefeller's treasonous activities and then blackmailed him. In exchange for Jewish silence, Rockefeller agreed to arrange for enough votes from Latin American nations to guarantee Israel's membership into the United Nations. The sad truth, say Loftus and Ahrens, is that the Jewish Zionists bought those extra votes with the blood of millions of Jewish Holocaust victims. Christopher Simpson's book called Blowback exposes recently declassified information on America's recruitment of Nazi war criminals into the CIA. Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, who built German rockets and dropped them on London, was also put on the new CIA payroll. Von Braun and his team of Nazi rocketeers were sent to Huntsville, Alabama. Hollywood honored von Braun as a collaborator on an American sci-fi movie and series of Walt Disney shows.
Let's take you back to 1958, 59, and I'm suddenly required to work with a Nazi. I grew up in World War II. Now, you couldn't expect me to suddenly have a great love for somebody that came out of Peenemünde and was firing rockets at the people in England and blowing them up. And furthermore, had been in Peenemünde where he had slave labor, etc. So how am I supposed to suddenly like that guy?
The international banksters and the men who served them had won the American, Russian, and British versions of monopoly by seizing control of the Bank of England and the U.S. Federal Reserve, and by wiping out the Russian czars. But the ultimate goal of the banksters was to win the world game. Their devious game plan was to divide the world into two warring power blocks: the Western capitalist bloc, led by the United States, and the Eastern Communist Bloc, led by Russia. Their next move was to transfer atomic weapons secrets to their Russian Communist Bloc through Victor Rothschild, who was the ringleader in Britain's biggest communist spy scandal, and through J. Robert Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project's leading atomic scientist.
In September 1949, the Soviet Union exploded its first A-bomb. America's monopoly on atomic weapons ended after only 4 years. Now, both superpowers had the means to destroy the world.
The next step was to stage a phony arms race and Cold War between their First World Capitalist Bloc and Second World Communist Bloc. Like sports teams, the U.S. and Russian superpowers needed recruits for their war games, so they forced new Third World members of the United Nations to choose sides. American Secretary of State John Foster Dulles warned Third World countries that you're either with us or you're against us. Korea and Vietnam were torn up like rags into half-communist, half-capitalist countries and became the playing field for phony war games between the bankster superpowers.
Marilyn Monroe in Korea, America's great sex symbol, innocent and alluring, caught in the blood and mud of the Korean War. To the battle-weary soldiers who gazed at her, she must have looked like an angel sent from heaven to ease the pain of fighting a God-forsaken war in a far-off land.
It's difficult and dangerous. But though generally outnumbered, American Sabres and British Meteors are outfighting the MiGs.
The lives of 4 million Korean civilians and 33,000 American soldiers were sacrificed in the 1950 Korean War, bringing the banksters another step closer to world domination. Like Korea, Vietnam was split into North and South Vietnam and became their next target. In 1954, the U.S. military dropped millions of tons of bombs on undefended Vietnamese civilians and turned their lush green countryside into blood-red killing fields. It was a butcherous campaign of terror, rape, torture, lies, and cover-ups. The U.S. military, who had already tested 2 radioactive atomic weapons of mass destruction on the people of Japan, decided to test their chemical weapons of mass destruction on the people of Vietnam. $70 million liters of chemical weapons of mass destruction were sprayed over the Vietnamese people, their water, and their countryside. The most lethal was Agent Orange, which defoliated, killed, and contaminated everything in its path like a radioactive atomic bomb. To this day, survivors suffer related cancers, genetic deformities, and permanent environmental damage. Many U.S. servicemen publicly confessed to their crimes and suffered haunting flashbacks.
Novel from New York, I have Vietnamese campaign ribbon, Vietnamese service ribbon, National Defense ribbon, and Purple Heart.
In spite of massive U.S. war protests, President Nixon increased America's military presence in Vietnam to 500,000 soldiers by 1969. It was Nobel Peace Prize winner Henry Kissinger who convinced Nixon to expand the Vietnam War to the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos, causing the mass murder of another 1 million innocent people and their families. On May 4th, 1970, America got a wake-up call. 6 peaceful anti-war student demonstrators from Kent State and Jackson State universities were shot dead by U.S. armed guards, while dozens of others were wounded. The message came through loud and clear: the power of the U.S. military could turn its weapons on its own citizens. In 1947, the United States played host to an international conference at Bretton Woods to put an end to world poverty and starvation caused by World War II. The idea was to give humanitarian loans to needy nations by creating a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund. But who would be put in charge of these billion-dollar megaloans? Who else but the U.S. Federal Reserve bankster families? Putting the U.S. Federal Reserve banksters in charge of humanitarian loans is like putting pedophiles in charge of daycare centers. Instead of helping the poor, the banksters turned the World Bank and International Monetary Fund into international pawn shops and robbed the poor. Just to qualify for a loan, desperate nations were forced to pawn their mines, forests, railways, power companies, and water systems, and agree to over 100 loan conditions at loan shark interest rates. To pay off the loans, they were forced to ignore laws that protected their environment, to lower wages, and to cut back on their education and on their health care. They were also forced to privatize and sell off their resources to crooked corporations like Enron. Lord Wakeham, the director of N.M. Rothschild & Sons, was on the audit committee of Enron and cooked the books and sucked billions from pension funds and investors before declaring bankruptcy. When poor nations were unable to pay their loans, they were given new loans to pay off the old loans. But these so-called bailout loans weren't about bailing out the poor. They were about bailing out and lining the pockets of loan underwriters like Citigroup and America's most notorious crooks and banksters. As desperately poor nations got more desperately poor, the filthy rich banksters got filthier rich, and God help anybody who got in their way. Davison Buddu, senior economist for the International Monetary Fund, resigned to, quote, wash my hands of the blood of millions of poor and starving people. When President John F. Kennedy tried to take back America by reviving U.S. government-printed money, his head was blown off in a Dallas motorcade. When his son planned to expose the ugly truth about his father's assassination, his small plane plunged into the ocean, killing all on board.